When there's an ocean of doubt in front of me and my back's up against the wall, I know it's an opportunity for my God to show his heart. And it may look impossible in the natural, but I know that it's not, 'cause I know that my God will come through. There is an ocean parting right in front of me. There is a Savior who stepped in and made a way for me. I'm walking in freedom, freedom. He set my feet on dry ground. There is an ocean parting right in front of me.
I find shade in the presence of my God. He's my shelter in the storm. He rescues me every single day. He's the constant, faithful one. And it may look impossible in the natural, but I know that it's not. 'Cause I know that my God will come through.
There is an ocean parting right in front of me. There is a Savior who stepped in and made a way for me. I'm walking in freedom, freedom. He set my feet on dry ground. There is an ocean parting right in front of me. Run, run, run into your arms. I will dance, dance, dance because of your love. I will shout your name. Jesus, be lifted high. I will run, run, run into your arms. I will dance, dance, dance because of your love. I will shout your name. Jesus, be lifted high. I will run, run, run into your arms. I will dance, dance, dance because of your love. I will shout your name. Jesus, be lifted high. There is an ocean parting right in front of me. There is a Savior who stepped in and made a way for me. I'm walking in freedom, freedom. You set my feet on dry ground. There is an ocean parting right in front of me. I will run, run, run into your arms. I will dance, dance, dance because of your love. I will shout your name. Jesus, be lifted high.
So today we are starting a new 10-week series called Made to Worship, and we are going to see more about God's plan to rescue people not only from being oppressed, but also so they can be gathered and close to Him and worship Him again. And we'll be focusing on the book of Exodus. Exodus is the second book in the Bible in the Old Testament. It comes after Genesis. And by looking at Exodus, we are going to see how God is faithful. This means that God always keeps His promises to His people. We're going to see how God keeps His promises to His people even though they are faced up against the most powerful enemies, and even though they keep breaking their promises to God. Now, to start off our talk about Exodus, we are going to have to rewind a little bit. We're going to have to go back to the very beginning in Genesis, and this is where God's plan to rescue people begins. And every story in Exodus is a part of God's great plan to rescue his people from sin and death. So in Genesis, we read that God made everything, and he also made people. God made people to be in a relationship with him, to be close to him, and to worship him. And he made people to rule over creation with him. But we all know that that's not how the story ends. We know that Adam and Eve, the first people, disobeyed God. They rejected him, turned their backs on him, and they decided to do things their own way. And we know that the punishment or the consequence for their sin was that they had to leave the Garden of Eden. In other words, they were separated from God. And ever since then, that would be every person's story. Every person would be born as a sinner, and their sin would keep them far away from God. But we also know that when God punished Adam and Eve, he made a promise. He made a promise that one day a rescuer would come, and this rescuer would save people from their sin and save them from death. Now, if we fast forward a little bit further in Genesis, we read about a guy called Abraham. God chose Abraham to be a part of his rescue plan, and he promised Abraham that he would have land, he would have many descendants, so he would have a great big family, and he also promised that through Abraham's family, everyone in the world would be blessed. Now, Abraham's family grew and grew exactly as God promised. Abraham had a son called Isaac, and Isaac had a son called Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons. And of these 12, one of them was the favorite. Can you guess who that is? I'm pretty sure you are thinking about Joseph right now. And Joseph ended up being sold to be a slave in Egypt, and it looked like God's plan was busy failing. But we know that is not the end of the story, and God used this as a part of his rescue plan. The land where God's people were, Canaan, had no more food. There was famine. But Joseph, while he was ruling alongside Pharaoh as second in charge in Egypt, he had a wise plan to store enough food to feed people through the years of the famine. And so that is how God used Joseph being sold into slavery and sent to Egypt to rescue his people, the Israelites. They ended up moving to Egypt where there was food, and there God's family kept on growing and growing and growing. And this is where we pick up our story in Exodus. In the beginning of Exodus, we read that God's family kept growing, and they got so big that the land was filled with them. But there was a new king in charge, a new Pharaoh. And this Pharaoh didn't know Joseph, and he didn't know God's people. And he did not care about them or like them at all. This Pharaoh became scared that the Israelites would grow powerful and that they would side with the Pharaoh's enemies and take over the land of Egypt. So he hatched a plan. He decided to make all the Israelites work so hard. He oppressed them, and every day he made them work harder and harder and harder as his slaves. But his plan did not work. The Bible tells us that the more Pharaoh oppressed God's people, the stronger and the greater in number they grew. Then Pharaoh came up with another plan. He decided to tell all the midwives to kill any sons who are born, any Hebrew boys. Now, a midwife is someone who helps a woman give birth to a baby. And sons in those days were very important because they were responsible for continuing the family line. So this is a very mean and evil plan. But even this plan didn't work. The midwives decided that they were going to obey God instead of obeying Pharaoh. They made the right choice. And God was good to the midwives because they obeyed him. Now, after both of these attempts fail, I'm sure that Pharaoh got pretty scared and pretty angry, and he made an evil law to finally put down God's people. He told all the Egyptian people that they must throw any Hebrew baby boy born into the Nile River. So any boy who was born into God's people, the Israelites, that boy had to be killed. This is a terrible plan. And Pharaoh seems like a terrible and very powerful ruler. What would happen to God's plan to save his people? Well, a little bit further, we read that there was a woman who was a part of God's family, and she had a son. She decided to hide her son for 3 months. But how do you hide a crying, screaming baby? She couldn't hide him forever. So when she couldn't hide him any longer, she decided to put him in the river. But not like the Egyptians were putting babies into the river to kill them. No, she put her baby into the river to protect him. She wove a basket and she sealed it with tar so that it would float. And she put the basket among the reeds by the banks of the Nile River. The baby boy's sister was watching. And then she saw this. She saw that Pharaoh's daughter, the princess, came down to the river for a bath. The Pharaoh's daughter saw the basket, and she opened it, and she found a child crying. In Exodus, we read that she felt sorry for the baby boy, and that she noticed he was one of the Hebrew boys, so he was someone who belonged to God's family, the Israelites. Moses' sister went to Pharaoh's daughter, and she asked if she must bring the boy's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter agreed. So Moses' mother could look after him while he was still a little baby. And when he was older, he was brought to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She called him Moses. So Moses, who was going to be killed like all the other baby boys born into God's family, he ended up living in the king's palace and being taught by him. His life was saved. And although Moses' mother put him in the basket and Pharaoh's daughter found him, God used them to save Moses. God saved Moses so that later he could use Moses to save his people from being slaves in Egypt. And in our next lessons coming up, we're going to see how Moses grows up to be the leader of God's people and how he eventually leads them out of Egypt. So today's story shows us something very important about God. It shows us that God keeps his promises even when it looks like his enemies are going to win. Pharaoh seemed pretty powerful, and it seemed like Pharaoh was going to win. But in the end, God was stronger, and he is always powerful than any ruler. We also learn that God keeps his people safe. Just like Moses was kept safe in the basket, we are also kept safe in Jesus. Moses was kept safe in the basket so that he didn't have to die. And when we trust in Jesus, we are also kept safe from death. Death as in God's punishment for our sin. Because Jesus stood in our place and took that punishment for us, even though he never sinned. And when we trust in him, God not only forgives our sin, but we also get Jesus' righteousness, which means that God sees us as if we never sin. So this amazing rescue story about how God rescued a baby boy who would one day save his nation from Egypt. This rescue story points us forward to the greatest rescue story, the one where God sent Jesus to save you and me from sin and death. Let's close our eyes and pray together. God, thank you so much for the Bible. Thank you for books like Exodus, where we can read about amazing rescues. But thank you that they all point forward to the rescue that we have in Jesus. Thank you for watching over Moses and for keeping him safe. And thank you that you also watch over us and keep us safe. Help us to trust you, God, and to trust that your promises will always come true. And help us to know that when we trust in Jesus, no one else, no matter how powerful they are, can ever do anything to harm us. Amen.